tabula rasa. Yes, there we go, super. So this lunchtime or this evening in Scotland, I'm going to talk about the edge of why and about creating technology for humans by using modern psychology. And to give a little bit of background in that, I'm a qualified psychologist. I've worked as a psychologist for 40 years. At the risk of being immodest and self-aggrandizing, I'm a multi-award winning psychologist. And I'm also intensely curious about human behavior and human nature. So I get intrigued by things, I get obsessed, fascinated by things. And one of the things I'm very intrigued by is how we can use technology to make our lives better and more interesting and deeper and wider. So I'm currently the CTO of an AI startup, the Letha Group. And in the Letha Group, what we do and what we are doing is creating new technology and technology for helping humans. And it's very interesting approaching technology from a psychological perspective, because one of the things I say, and some people get slightly miffed by it, is that technology is wasted on technologists. I think coming from a human, a psychological perspective on how technology is created and used is very useful. So what we're started off with, we always start off with a little thread, something, a dissonance, something that's diverging, something that doesn't seem quite as it should. And one of the things I have done, used to do, was I used to work as a prison psychologist. And in the challenges that everyone is experiencing, which have been intensified and amplified by the COVID pandemic, people are speaking far more about their mental health issues. And one of the places where I know that that is particularly prevalent is in any sort of penitentiary or prison. It's really hard to get access to mental health support in a prison. And as myself and my co-founders investigated this, we realized it's really hard to get mental health access in lots of other places, like psychogeriatric wards and hospitals and schools, and in places at the edges of society. So the natural solution would be, well, let's just train more therapists, let's have more coaches, let's have more counselors, let's have more and more support. But the reality is there's not enough resource to do that. So we thought, why don't we employ technology to try and help us provide mental health access for all? And in the mental health access we were starting to explore and engage with, something that came up again and again was the need. It's always great, if you're working with a human or inventing technology, to understand the need and to ask yourself that question: where is the need? Where is the need that we need to engage with and explore and address? So this picture, one of the groups of people we spent a lot of time with were service personnel, both serving and ex-service personnel, veterans, who were experiencing extreme PTSD and were considering ending their lives. And the phrase that came up again and again and again was they wanted to speak to their self in the future. So we heard this from PTSD sufferers. We heard it from people in other services, what we call blue light services here in Great Britain. So police, medical, fire services. And we heard it from lots and lots of people. They wanted to be able to speak to their future self, which is in your role as a coach or as a therapist or a counselor, it's what you help your client do. Now, to do this technically, what came up again and again is that you want to speak to your future self, then the ways of doing it.
Ian, just a second. Everyone, I'm going to ask you all to go on mute unless you have a question. And if you do, just drop it over into the chat because we're picking up someone else's phone right there. Okay, thanks all.
Thank you, Aaron. That could have been someone speaking to their future self. The technologies have been already invented and
Well played. Well played.
So this idea of speaking to your future self is a very, very interesting one, because it is what we do as humans, as people who support other humans, as therapists and counselors and coaches. And it's very interesting talking to technologists about this. We talked about to technologists, to entrepreneurs, to investors, and so on. And they approached it in a very direct way, but not a particularly helpful way, because the suggestion we got again and again of how to do this was we needed to invent time travel. But the reality was, still is, we don't have the budget to do that, or ironically, the time to do that. So we had to think of another way of encouraging and helping people to speak to their future self by providing them with some technology to do that. One of the big challenges in working with technology, particularly this level of power in technology, is it very quickly becomes centralized. That you need lots and lots and lots of computing power. You need big server farms, you need lots of GPUs to process all the information that you would have in something like a chatbot or a more advanced version, which we call a conversational. And this is what centralized computing looks like. This is a Chinese Bitcoin mine. It's hundreds and thousands of GPUs doing lots and lots and lots of calculations in a very, very centralized way. And this didn't really fit in with our idea of edge computing, the idea that we are working with edge technology, but we're also working with people who are at the edge and on the edge. So we decided we want to try and do something that was far more distributed rather than centralized. So this was our idea, distributing and democratizing technology. And in my tiny little picture, if you can see me on screen, this is the thing, one of our prototypes here that's shown in there. It does look like a budget remake of the Poseidon adventure or the Heart Locker, but on this we are trying to build a ubiquitous AI psychotherapist. So that's kind of the backstory, how we are using modern technology and modern psychology together, just where they meet in that lens of the Venn diagram to create something, invent something that will help people and no one else has created it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychological processes we used to work through this and to help people engage with their future selves. This is what it looked like when we started off technologically. So just endless code, lots and lots of coding, me doing coding, my team doing coding, and making lots and lots of prototypes, coming up with ideas, prototyping the ideas, abstracting information from them, and then seeing the bigger story. And this is how it started to develop. So the first thing we made was a conversationer, as we call our advanced chatbots, for a DSM. So that's a psychiatric psychological process for understanding people's levels of anxiety and depression. This one's called GAD2, which is general anxiety and depression. It's an instrument for doing that. So it just really asks a user questions, but instead of doing the usual kind of radio button Likert scale thing, it actually engages with the user, the client in a conversation. So the GAD2, as the name suggests, is only 2 questions, so that was quite straightforward. Then we got a bit carried away and did one with 9 questions. This one is to deal with people who have anxiety around COVID, which we found very, very useful. And then we wanted to extend it even more. And so now we have something called PHQ-2, Patient Health Questionnaire, which is for dealing with depression, mild to moderate depression and anxiety. PHQ-9, which is a version with 9 questions. But then we made something called Bunty, and this extends the technology even further. And it takes the technology into being able to hold a clean language conversation with a user. So now we have this one operating, and we've started to use the technology in a way that we can have a little box somewhere or someone on the web or the phone, and at any time they want, they can engage effectively with their future self, engage with that part of themselves and have a conversation. the reason we started off with clean language conversation is in a clean language conversation, as you know well about and found out more about from Caitlin Walker last time, is the main thing you look for in a clean language conversation is a linguistic image. And this is the key to doing all this work, is working with linguistic imagery and the metaphors and metonyms that are chained off that. So this is, I don't know if it's quite small there, but I'm not going to attempt to increase my screen size, but this is Bunty talking about an ocean here. I'm talking more about the image, so tell me about the ocean, where does the ocean come from, what would you like to have happen to the ocean? So the classic kind of clean language questions. Now, as we were doing this, clean language is great, but it does have some limitations. You start to bang up against some boundaries. So we wanted to extend that a bit more and make it even more useful for a human to work with. The big challenge here is most popular psychology is junk psychology. It's what I call trickle-down psychonomics. And it's a result of someone having a book on the New York Times bestseller list, or a really popular website, or being an influencer on Facebook or Insta or something like that. They have this really simple idea which completely ignores the complexities of working with an actual human being. And the key thing that trickle-down psychonomics does is it views the brain mechanistically. And we can hear this in our everyday language. People say things like, oh, I'm having a mental breakdown. Or when you're thinking, I can hear the wheels turning. Or can you help me with this? I'm a little bit rusty on it. Or this project is going off the rails. So we have the idea that the brain is something mechanical. It's very predictable. It's something that can be fixed. That if someone is having a breakdown, we just have to get our therapist or counselor or coach's spanner out and do a few little tweaks and they'll be fine. And what happens with that, when we view someone as a machine, as their brain mechanistically, then we have a mechanistic approach with them. We think that they are just a cog in a corporate wheel, in a corporate machine. And if that component's not working, that cog's not working, we just replace them. It's not a really human way to work. The most complex machines we have are computers. So people often take a computational approach. This is the approach taken in things like neuro-linguistic programming, where your brain is just a computer, and if you want to perform better, then you just have to upgrade your software. And very often what happens is you have something like Windows 10 going to Windows 11, doesn't quite work out, and it's worse off than before. Computational brain has been around for about 70 years now, since this guy, Frank Rosenblatt, in 1958. He built something called the perceptron, which is actually that. It's not the sort of thing you can carry around in your pocket. And it was meant to be able to sense, recognize, remember, and respond like the human mind. But of course, it doesn't, and it didn't. But people still keep trying to take this mechanistic computational approach to dealing with people and engaging with them. And even the imagery that's used in something like a clean language conversation can maintain that imagery and emphasize it rather than doing something more natural and more human. So people view the brain as linear and reductive, but it's a non-linear amplifier. That's how your brain works. It actually amplifies situations, and it does it in quite a deterministic way, but a non-linear way. Your brain is not a computer. What your brain actually is a simulator trying to be a predictor. Your brain is always trying to predict things because that makes things more certain and makes outcomes more certain. It's a kind of inference processor. It's a simulator. And we call the simulations that your brain runs, the usual way of describing them is a story. So we're continually running simulations of the world and then trying to validate those simulations in the real world and feeding that information back into our brain. And it's a continual looping process over and over again, many times a second. So even as I'm chatting away in Scotland here, and you're listening wherever you might be, you are simulating a story, validating that story, and you do this mostly unconsciously. Very often you're not aware that you're doing it. So your brain isn't a mechanistic predictor. Your brain is a world simulator. Your brain simulates your perceptions of the world and the perspectives that you create around it. And you continually update those. You update them all the time. You abstract information from them, and then you disseminate those abstractions as the stories about yourself and the world that you inhabit. Back in the end of the 19th century, William James was a contemporary of Freud and Jung. William James actually offered the first academic psychology course in America, and he's often described as the father of psychology in a slightly patriarchal way. His perspective was that humans were just observers. Perceptions were just observations of the world around them, and that's all you ever had to work with. And that view is still prevalent. It's prevalent in things like the OODA loop from Colonel John Boyd here, of observing, orienting, deciding, and acting, that we are actually just observing rather than actively participating in generating our perceptions. Around the same time as William James, Sigmund Freud, and Carl Jung, was a guy called Thomas Graham Brown, who was Scottish. He was a Scottish neuroscientist and neurosurgeon. He was also a mountaineer. He said this amazing thing. He said, the function of the senses is to modulate internally generated imagery. And what he meant by that was we are unconsciously always generating images, and those can be visual, they can be auditory, they can be olfactory, they can be haptic images, but we're constantly generating those unconsciously and then validating them with our senses in the outside world. So that was in 1911. Recently, Rodolfo Linas in Colombia has proven this with even more evidence. And Jeff Hinton, who some of you may recognize as being the father, or yet another patriarch of artificial intelligence at Google, he wrote this brilliant paper in 2006 when he was developing ImageNet, which really opened up the latest wave of artificial intelligence. And the title of that paper from the University of Toronto is "To Recognize Shapes, First Learn to Generate Images." So now we're starting to get someplace. Instead of viewing the brain as a computer, what we really need to do is start to make computers far more brain-like. And so that's why in developing the technology that we're developing just now at Letha, we use a guide. It could be a framework, it could be a model. We call it a guide. And it's a psychological guide to help people understand how they generate their perceptions of their world as they navigate complexity and uncertainty. And how it's set up, it's very simple. We have an inner world and an outer world. So we all have this. We have an inner life and we have an outer life. And this is a boundary here between them. So inside, outside. We also have a psychological life and a logical life. So we have psychological here and then logical above. Psychological is what might be called, what Freud or Jung might call the unconscious or the subconscious. And logical is your conscious awareness. So we have an inner life and outer life, an unconscious awareness and a conscious awareness. The image is where it all starts. We imagine things, we unconsciously generate imagery, we loop round, we validate it in the outside world. We then abstract information from that, theory from that, thoughts, ideas from that, we symbolize that, and then we feed that back out and disseminate it as stories. You can look at it as like a 2x2 matrix, like a Boston square, but the reality is that this is a continual loop. It's a continual perceptual loop. It's always moving round, and usually in this nature, continually looping and looping and looping many, many times a second. So what we're doing here is engaging with the process of perception, how we actually perceive the world and create our perceptions of it. So we have an imagining loop, which are feelings, emotions, instincts, experiences, moods, sentiments, affects. We push that forward into a validating loop. We make sense of them. It's very stable, it's practical, it's physical, it's consistent. it's pragmatic, it's persistent. From that validation, from that physicality, we abstract information. So thoughts, theories, ideas, knowledge, ideas. And then we disseminate those. We send them out into the world again, into the outside world, mainly in stories we tell, our creativity, our explorations, our intuitions, the memes and the tropes that we share. So that's the psychological description of it. A more accessible description is hearts, hands, heads, and horizons. So we start off always with what you feel in your heart. That guides what you make with your hands, which guides what you think in your head, which feeds forward to what you seek in your horizons. So those are the loops that are continually flowing around. And if you feel actualized, if you feel in flow, then you have that constant flow around those loops. So what Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described as flow, what Stephen Kotler has done with the flow genome, when you feel in flow, everything's flowing around there. The interesting thing happens as a coach and a psychologist and a therapist and a counselor, what happens when things are not flowing so well? So if it's only in here, only emotional and mental, it's in your inner life. So usually things that are quite idealized and tested and validated, making plans about plans, quite introspective. If it's only outside, if you only think of an outer life and neglect your inner life, then it tends to be unemotional, maybe not so self-aware, lacks empathy, maybe lacks imagination. If everything is in the unconscious, then things tend to be quite illusory, inconsistent, subjective, lots of fantasizing. And then above the line, only consciousness, only conscious rather than unconscious, tends to be very objective, very analytical, unemotional, quite skeptical, constrained, and quite austere. So here's a question for you. You've got a minute or two to answer it. Where do you think you loop most? What loops do you find yourself in most of the time, or in a particular context? Do you find yourself imagining things, feeling about things, emoting? Do you find yourself making things a lot? You need to produce things, have tangible things. You spend a lot of time thinking and theorizing, or do you spend lots of time exploring things, or what combinations of these loops do you find yourself in? So I'll give you a wee minute. I'll give you a minute to think about that.
So everyone, I'll also put Ian's question over in the chat, just so you've got it there as well.
Okay,
Ian,
so do what to get. Okay.
I was just going to say, we've got a few answers starting to come in already over in the chat.
Right. I'll check those out as I ask you the next question. So I'm not going to give you a lot of time to answer questions, because a lot of this I just like to, usually the answers that come up first are coming straight from your unconscious, straight from your psychology, and usually those are the most powerful ones in here. So as you're coming in with the answer to that question, there are two more here. How do your loops flow? How freely do you find your perceptions flow across those boundaries between imagining, producing, theorizing, and exploring? So I'm just flicking through the answers here. Is imagining and producing possible? Yeah, absolutely. You can have three of them and one not there. There are, I'm not quite sure how many combinations of them are. How do your loops flow? So a request to show the emotional loop activities. I'm just going to go back a little bit to show that slide.
Thank you for catching that, Ian, because I was just about to verbalize that Mero wanted to see that again. So, yeah.
So feelings, emotions, imaginings, instincts, experiences, moods. So anything that you might consider emotional. And as we'll see as we go through, anything emotional is very much connected with imagery and linguistic images. fact, I'll say it just now, just as answers are coming for the second question, is when we express an emotion, then, so say you're angry with me, and you say, Ian, I'm angry with you, I'm just a bit disappointed. If you say, Ian, I'm absolutely fuming with you, I think, oh, you're so angry, you're on fire. Or, Ian, I'm so frustrated with you, it feels like I'm banging my head off a brick wall. I think, well, that's really interesting, because as soon as you share an image like that, that is you expressing an emotion directly, which is the sort of thing you use in clean language, but you can use in more advanced and more complex ways of working with a person's psychology. So anytime you express an image, and usually a linguistic image, then what is actually happening is you are expressing a powerful emotion. So
but, what's the, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the slide you showed was just before the one I was asking you about, which I don't see the difference between both. I can't understand the slide just after the one you were explaining just now.
So which one don't you understand? This one?
So what's the difference between this one and the one before? I mean, I was expecting to have the same
so this
model.
One, so in this framework, we can have different labels in the loops and above and below and to the sides, but they're really describing the same thing. But is that an unconscious? This is where we start to, it can be very constraining in a conversation if we're continually trying to define things. So this is when we work with the unconscious and we work with psychology. What we're doing is describing something, it's the same thing, but just in a different way. So when you imagine something, when you emote, when you actually feel it, it comes from inside, it comes from your heart, it comes from your chest. When you validate something, you usually do that with your hands. So another way to describe it would be emotions for hearts or imagining, physical for hands or validating, thinking or theorizing for heads and symbolizing, and creating and seeking for horizons or disseminating.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
The reason I was, reason I was asking is I do a lot of research on ADHD and hypertension people, so people with a very high IQ, because I coach them. And one of the specifics of people with ADHD, which are very different from people with anxiety and depression disorders, is that the environment plays a really huge role in the way they behave internally, how they construct their self-image, etc. All those belief graphs that they construct, etc. So the loop at the bottom right, the horizons loop, I was instinctively going to say, oh, there must be the environment. There must be something that they can do physically outside of them, outside of the body. And that's why I was really surprised. It just says horizon. So I wanted to understand the thinking behind it. Yeah.
So this is the outside of the body. So it's all the things that you go out seeking. So above here, this is the physical outside world, or the conscious outside world. This is the unconscious. So when someone with ADHD, they're constantly searching for something and looking for something. And this is very, very contextual as well, because what are you making with your hands? Are you making bread? Are you making an AI psychotherapist? Are you making a spaceship? What is the physical thing there? So let's come back to that, because I'd like to, I've got a feeling myself, because I like exploring things, I'd like to have a big conversation with you about using this with ADHD, because it's something I work with across here in the UK. But let's just go back into this. And the third question here is, what boundaries could be more connected for you? Would you like to connect more between inside and outside? Would you like to connect more between psychological and logical? Would you like to connect your theories more into stories, make them richer, make them less austere? What boundaries could be more connected for you? So a minute or so for that.
Thank you.
Yes, you can be in all four loops, yeah, absolutely. And that's when you feel that you're in flow. We tend to do it unconsciously a lot of the time. And when you have that feeling of being in flow, you do kind of lose track of time. You get very, very absorbed in what's going on. So if you have a little think about what boundaries could be more connected for you.
Ian, before you move on, I'm having a question over in the chat about clarifying what horizons is for.
Yeah, so I think we've just done that with Diva. That's what we've just done. That's no, it's from Sherry. Yeah. So horizons is it's what humans do. So we're always, there's that part of you that's out seeking horizons. The reasons it's horizons is it's just an alliteration. It begins with H, and so in that we had hearts, hands, heads, and it could have been stories, which doesn't really begin with. It could be histories. It's just so when I use this framework with children, that's what I tend to use with them. So horizons is just that thing of creating, exploring, telling stories, listening to stories. It's your unconscious outer world. So another way of thinking about it is thinking about in an organization, if you're doing coaching with people in an organization, we would describe it as the organizational culture. So we can imagine it as all the things that are outside you, which are not, you're not conscious of. So it's all the unconscious outer world. There's a graphic coming up quite soon that will explain it a bit more. Which is this one. So the usual way that we think of things when we're thinking logically is we think that, here's another way of describing those things that I was touching on there: emotional, mental, physical, and cultural. So these again, so in this framework, we have lots of different labels for it, but we've got the same 4 things happening. And by mapping these things together, by mapping emotions to images to hearts, then it makes it a lot easier to engage with, to use a quite simple guide to deal with very complex things. So we usually think that the logical, conscious world is by far the most important. But Albert Einstein said, imagination is more important than knowledge. Imagination is more important than information. Benjamin Liebe in the 1970s at the UCSF Medical School, George Lakoff, University of Berkeley, Stanislas Dehaene at the Lycée de Paris. What they discovered in their research was that 98% of human awareness is unconscious. It happens unconsciously. We're only really consciously aware of 2% of what's going on. So what we really need to do is turn this around, turn it upside down. And this is how it looks. So our unconscious, both inside and outside, is far more prevalent. It's at least 98% of our awareness is unconscious. And the main way that we are describing that is through stories. So that's why stories are so important. So remember, the brain is a simulator. The brain is continually generating stories. Simulations are stories. They don't have to be things like War and Peace, like Leo Tolstoy wrote. They can be things like For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. 6 words, Ernest Hemingway. It's an amazing story. The thing that makes a story very powerful is something that will make it emotional. It's drama and tension. And we're continually trying to get as much information across those perceptual boundaries as possible in that perceptual flow rate. What becomes very interesting from the perspective of a psychologist and technologist is that people like Claude Shannon, again, a patriarch, the father of information theory. In information theory, we're continually trying to describe something as complex as a complex, very, very complex thing in as little information as possible. Andrei Kolmogorov, the Russian mathematician, also did the same work. This is where we get Kolmogorov complexity from. Here's Frank Rosenblatt again with his perceptron. It's an explosion of spaghetti factory. when we start dealing with all these connections, these boundaries, these perceptual flows in a human, it gets very, very complex. And like psychology, when we start to deal with complexity, we have to go back to the people who originated complexity. Another patriarch here, Murray Gell-Mann, the father of complexity studies at Santa Fe in New Mexico, along with John Henry Holland. And what John and Murray both said was that complexity was all about connections. It was all about making connections. The more complex something was, the more connected it was. And that's why most popular complexity is junk complexity. It's all based on constraints. There's this classic piece from Alicia Guerrero's book Dynamics in Action. It's on page 133 if you want to find it. And this phrase, this sentence just cracks me up because it loses context. And so Alicia is trying to describe constraints, and she says, for example, the physical link between the tibia and the peroneus on the one hand. You say, wait a minute, the tibia is in the leg, how's it connected to your hand? And the knee joint on the other hand systematically constrains this. So she actually mentioned, she uses this image on the other hand about 50 times in this book. But anything to do with constraints is not the original working complexity. The original working complexity and far more powerful working complexity was all about making connections. So that's why we're so interested in these flows across perceptual boundaries. When you work with constrained complexity, you put yourself in a prison. You narrow things down, you remove possibilities, you prevent further exploration. When you connect things, complexity, take something really, really simple and start connecting it. And as we do that using imagery and emotions, then you start to generate something really powerful experience for yourself, but also when you're working with a client. So when you're working with linguistic images, if you can start to connect them and chain those out, those become really powerful. And that's in a story. This happens all the time. You will have all these linguistic image references and resonances connecting all the way through a story. And as you start to pick up on those and work with them, then that becomes very powerful. So say I say I'm banging my head off a brick wall, and clean language therapists might say, well, tell me about the wall. But what I want to know is who built the wall? Tell me about the bricks. Where is, so all that part, let's start marching that out. Find the bricklayer, let's have a conversation with the bricklayer. Let's start role playing that in the conversation, because then you can get to a healthy and positive outcome, usually far more powerful. So Claude Shannon, father of information technology, I always think he looks like Mr. Spock in this photograph with his slightly pointy Vulcan-esque ears. And the question is now is, can we connect the logical and the psychological? Can we get a free flow of stories and images going backwards and forwards across that boundary? So when we do that, we generate a story. We do that by asking questions. And the main question that we ask is a question that you're not meant to ask in clean language. It's a very good question to ask beyond that. The question is why. This is getting across the edge of why. And the first question that I'm going to ask you, I'm going to ask you a series of questions over the next few minutes. You've got a minute to answer it, and usually the image that comes up first, just it'll flash into your mind or into your heart, is the one you want. It's going to be a linguistic image. So it could be something, it could be a dog, it could be an eagle, it could be a half dog, half eagle, it could be anything. The question is, what image connects you to why you focus on achieving a challenging ambition? So whatever image flashes into your mind, just write that down. Thank you, Mara. That's a brilliant answer. And Lani and Rachel, it's a great. So the next question, what image connects you to why you maintain the stability of routine? Just let the image flash up. Don't censor it. Don't criticize it. Don't judge yourself. Don't think that's a terrible image. I must think of a better one. Just whatever flashes up for you. Yeah, thank you. That one from Big Oz, Texas. Thanks for that mechanistic answer there, keeping the cogs of the wheel turning. That's fine. Okay, the next image is, what image connects you to why you are curious about different ideas? What image connects you to why you are curious about different ideas? Just let the image flash up for you. Just let it emerge from your unconscious.
So I'm seeing that Tanya on the iPhone has raised her hand. So Tanya, if you're there, go ahead and come off mute.
That was a mistake. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, maybe it wasn't Tanya, maybe it was your unconscious.
Maybe it was her future self again.
Yeah,
Now they're taking action.
I'm so sorry.
Don't worry.
That's super. This is what we want. This is it's really nice to have things that are not predictable and mechanistic. Okay, so the next image. I'll just click it. What image connects you to why you step outside your comfort zones? What image connects you to why you step outside your comfort zones? It may be challenging to step outside a comfort zone and try not to overthink things and analyze them and be objective, but just let your unconscious speak. And for the next image connection, what image connects you? That should be to why you display your creative talents. What image connects you to why you display your creative talents? These are great answers, so thanks for sharing these. Thanks for opening up your hearts and your images and sharing them. The next image to connect to is What image connects you to why you help others by clarifying details? What image connects you to why you help others by clarifying details? And then the next image. What image connects you to why you decide to make crucial commitments? What image connects you to why you decide to make crucial commitments? Just whatever flashes straight up for you. Okay, and the next one. What image connects you to why you feel transformed by your deeper purpose? What image connects you to why you feel transformed by your deeper purpose? And next, what image connects you to why you develop your greater potential? What image connects you to why you develop your greater potential? Okay, just a few more questions now, not many to go. What image connects you to why you establish your real authority? What image connects you to why you establish your real authority? What image connects you to why you liberate value by unique thinking? What image connects you to why you liberate value by unique thinking? And the final question, remember, there are no right or wrong answers. It's just whatever emerges from your unconscious. What image connects you to why you are inspired to go beyond the impossible? What image connects you to why you are inspired to go beyond the possible? These are great answers. We could have a day-long workshop doing this. It would be wonderful. Anyway, so in those questions, they might have seemed quite unusual, a bit off the wall, maybe a bit ambiguous. There's no right answer. The questions are intended from a psychological perspective, just to get that flow going between the psychological and the logical, to help you become more aware of how you view the world, how you perceive the world is often generated by the images you have of it and have of yourself. And many of those images you may not be consciously aware of. So in terms of inventing time travel, I've got to do that because I'm aware we don't have very much longer to chat here. But in terms of inventing time travel, in terms of using the human edge, using human psychology, using a more modern perspective on complexity, how did that work out? So here's what we've made so far. So this is the conversation of the AI psychotherapist. Actually, in action, here are some screenshots from it. So this is just running on someone's phone, and it's just working with these mental images, these linguistic images all the time. So rather than making humans like computers, this is the start of computers becoming more human-like. So this is me banging my head off a brick wall with trying to do the voice responsive technology in this particular AI conversation. So there we go. So that is the end of me talking. One of the things I would invite you to do, hopefully we'll have a bit of time for a bit of Q&A here, but those 12 images that I invited you to share and that you wrote down, a very interesting, it might be helpful thing for you to do afterwards if you have some time, is then to connect those images for you to make an image, think of an image, let an image surface that connects, say, the first and second images, the second and third, and so on. Think of what character might enact that image, or what object you might use, or what place it might be in, or what event or what context. Because as you do that, you might get quite an interesting story emerging that might be quite useful, or it might help you become more aware of a situation. Anyway, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just now, and if there's time for some questions, I'll be delighted to answer some of those.
So all, if you would like to ask questions, please go ahead and come off mute. We would welcome those questions right now. And also, I'm going to be putting Ian's LinkedIn profile over in the chat. So if anyone would like that, it will be there as well if they'd like to connect with him.
I'm just scrolling through the answers to those imagery questions. These are just fabulous.
Yeah. Clearly people have gotten, you know, the whole metaphor, you know, connecting. Yeah. So I'm seeing that Rami has raised a hand.
Yep. Hello. Is my audio good?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. Hello. So even though I didn't really, first of all, this was pretty great to see this insight from this standpoint, and really just making this transparency and how our brain works to some extent, right? Especially in these more professional environments when we were exposed to them. Now, I wonder if this exercise we just did, first of all, I'd like to share with everyone, and if I wonder if that was the case with anyone else's, the images were never one image. It was a process or a feeling that we were immersed in, rather than just one image to stick on. I don't know, I wasn't even able to just capture that one image as much as it was a scene of images and certain emotions. So I'm not sure if anyone else had that happening, but it's pretty hard to just stick to one image. But I wonder, this exercise, has it ever been done to where people were asked to draw instead of describing?
Yeah, absolutely, Rami. So the I would normally do drawing in something that was face to face or with a bit more time. I've shared this with Erin before. The classic example I have is I went to, I was invited to facilitate a meeting, a board meeting, a board that was in conflict. And I'm quite often asked to do that because I can give the appearance of being an angry Scotsman, and people tend to not start fights while I'm there. But there was a lot of conflict in there. And the thing I always look for in a situation like that is I'm looking for the first linguistic image, because then we can start to work with it and get into the unconscious, get into the hearts and horizons. So I went in, and for the first 5-10 minutes, it was the usual euphemisms, platitudes, jargon. And then the CFO said, well, we're all in the same boat here. And I said, right, draw me a picture of the boat. So I got out 14 sketch pads and pens, and these are all old white dudes. I know I'm an old white dude, but they're old white dudes. Oh, we're not doing that, we're not doing that. But I persuaded them, and of course we all get different boats. And the process from that was then got 14 drawings of different boats. We have a fleet of boats. We've got destroyers, we've got aircraft carriers, we've got submarines, we've got ocean liners, we've got sailing boats, we've got guys in kayaks. So all those things, and then it becomes really, really rich to do that, because then you can start to act things out, you start to role play. And what happens is you're not in that conscious part up here anymore. You're not working with that. People have disengaged that, and it's all down here. It's all in the heart, and it's all in the possibilities, the horizons. So yeah, working with images is fantastic. As you might be able to see from here, I also do it with sound. So doing auditory imagery, sometimes with people who have no sight or partially sighted. This is another very powerful way to work with images and doing that, just to try and get away from critical objective thinking, if that answers your question.
It does. It does. I mean, especially it's about the medium of expression at that point, right? I mean, there are only so many ways we can. I mean, I wouldn't say is it limitless or is it not. I guess it depends on the circumstances we put ourselves in, right, to let those expressions come about, or the process of it to actually happen. But yeah.
Well, so Lakoff and Johnson, who did a lot of the seminal work on metaphor, they reckoned that a visual, a linguistic image was used usually every 20 words by someone speaking naturally. So it's really hard. Futurists try and monitor yourself, how far you can go without using some sort of linguistic image. Like even things like, I've got a mountain to climb, or positional ones like, putting that behind me, or what's coming up for us, what's ahead, or I'm feeling up, feeling down. So you can always pick up on those things.
Yeah, I think it's like 4 to 6 metaphors every minute is about the number right there based on that. It's when you think about that, it's an astounding. You're like, wow. Yeah.
Well, we are, and as Thomas Graham Brown and Anil Seth and Rodolfo Linas have all shown, we are imaginal creatures. That's what Jung really spoke about, and James Hillman and James Wallace. It's all about, and it's really hard to say something like that because it seems so intangible. But everything we do is generated from imagery.
So Ian, so Remy, are you good? Because I've got two more questions.
Thank you. Sure. Go ahead. Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Thank you, really. It's great.
So Sherry is asking, have you asked these questions with people with known mental health conditions? And if so, what was that experience like?
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. So yeah, I have done. So I have worked in a lot of areas with people with mental health conditions, and across a spectrum as well. So people just with mild anxiety, all the way to people who have serious mental health conditions, and really dramatic, tense situations where I've been invited to talk someone down from a high place where they might do themselves some harm. So in doing that, then it becomes, it's a very unthreatening way to engage with someone. Because usually what happens, so, if someone says to you, I had this one night, quite a while ago, I had a corporate client in New York, and a very, very successful man. And he phoned me up one night. Well, it was evening for him, but it was the middle of the night for me. It was 3 a.m. And he phoned me up and said, Ian, I'm just going to say goodbye here. And I thought, well, this is quite unusual, phoning me up at this time, and my girlfriend wasn't very happy about the call in the middle of the night. But he said, I'm going to, I'm just saying goodbye. And I thought, well, there's something wrong here. So I started speaking to him about it. And he said he was going to end his life by suicide. So the thing that you might want to do then is say, oh, don't do that. Don't do that, Bill. That'd be a terrible thing. No, don't do that. Think of your family, think of your wife, think of all your business empire. But you can't really do that. You can't do it in a threatening, declarative, imperative way. So a way into it is you can say, can you tell me something about the story that's brought you to this decision? Yeah. So then you're engaging with the simulation that they're creating of the world. Or can you tell me about the journey that's brought you to this understanding? So in doing that, when you are engaging with someone who has some mental health condition, then by not being critical, by not being judgmental, by not trying to fix them, saying, oh, they've got a screw loose, this man's mad, he's got a screw loose, you can actually start to engage with them at that imaginal level. Yeah. And once you start engaging with them there and getting them to surface some imagery, then you work with the images, and then you're not judging the person in any way. It's not like you're saying they're bad. You're just working with it. They have shared some images with you, so you both work through the images, and it can be really helpful. Some people who have severe mental health disorders, it works up to a point, but you have helped that person to become more aware. And the key thing is be more accepting of themselves.
Terry's also asked an interesting follow-up question about working with people with receptive language disorders. Have you done any work with that?
So again, with that, working, I can Rami's question, working visually, just getting to draw something is usually very, very helpful. Getting to make something or finding something where they're not being judged on their use of language or how they receive it. And again, if we just go back to that very simple guide of the human edge, is when we're trying to surface an image, that this is why I invite you to write it down. If you actually make that physical, if you actually use your hands to do something, then it makes it tangible, and that image is no longer some free-floating thing that may or may not be judged. It's an actual thing that you can start to work with. And if you want to have more of a conversation with that about receptive language disorders, then I'm more than happy to do that.
Anyone else before we turn Ian back to dinner? I'm seeing two people with raised hands. It looks like Maru and Rami. Rami, is that still from the earlier?
Yes, it is. Thankfully, It wasn't my hand actually up here, so that's good.
Oh, good. All right, and Maru, are you still there?
Yeah, I was patiently waiting. So thanks, Aaron, for giving me the opportunity. Ian, I have a question about using this in a real scenario. So when you do contracting with a client, do you have to explain the thinking and the models behind this every time before you start working with the imagery? Some people might be very how can I say, unreceptive to doing this. They could tell you something like, I feel like I'm being profiled by a serial killer psychologist by the FBI. What are you going to tell me that my drawings say that I don't know.
Yeah. So that is well, the example, the anecdote I shared about the conflicted board with the 14-year-old white guys is exactly that. And I seem to end up working with lots of people like who have got very fixed views. They are very successful in their own right, but I take it as a personal challenge. I think so. It's really interesting in how we do this, man, because what you're actually doing, if we go back to the stuff that Jung did and even Piaget did, Jean Piaget did, without sounding too cliched, we are actually connecting with the inner child. And people who are very, very fixed in their ways or who have abandoned their inner child can find it very challenging to reconnect with it. And I have worked and still do a little bit of work as a child psychologist. That's the first thing you invite a child to do, is to draw, to dance, to sing, all those parts of it. And usually someone who seems really unreceptive to it is part of them inside, because we're not just one identity, we are multiple identities. So in this 63-year-old Scotsman, you know, there is a 9-year-old boy, there's an 84-year-old Scotsman, there's the embodiment of my father and my mother and all those parts of it. So they're not just one identity. So in anyone, in that 98% at least of the unconscious, there will be a child, there will be an artist, there will be a dancer, even though the conscious objective part doesn't want to show that to the world because it will make them feel vulnerable. So getting beyond that guardedness, and usually I do it in that way, just like, can you draw me a picture? And if they are defensive, then that tells me something straight away. And they might think I'm trying to profile them in case they're a serial killer, but usually I'm not. I'm not giving them Horshash Inkblot tests or Murray's thematic apperception test or anything like that. Just ask them to do quite a simple, innocent thing, just to sketch something out. So, but people are terrified of that, of showing the real them, and that part of them inside, the part that does understand what goes beyond the possible, does understand unique thinking, does want to go beyond the horizons. People can feel very, very vulnerable about opening up. So that's part of giving a backstory and just saying, here's something we can draw out, do it in the back of a beer mat or a napkin, and we're just going to go through this. You can do that.
So, Ian, I'm seeing 2 more questions come in there, and then I'm going to close off the questions because I know everyone needs to get back and you need to get to dinner. How do you spell the name of the child psychologist that you referenced?
So the one I mentioned there was Piaget, P-I-G-E-T. You can look at people like, so Jean Piaget, Swiss psychologist. You can look at people like Rudolf Steiner. And there's an I and there's an A in there, so it's P-I-A-G-E-T. John Dewey as well. There are a number of people, and it's very interesting from a psychological perspective that you may just think you're dealing with children, but it's a sort of really obvious thing to say. We all start off as children, so working with developmental psychology or evolutionary psychology, it's always a really interesting place to start to understand how we create our perceptions and generate our perspectives.
And then Sherry, the last question from Sherry was, what does a person who is defensive about drawing a picture tell you?
It tells me that they need to speak to their future self. They need to have a conversation with their future self, because all that part in the unconscious, that 98% underneath that line between the logical and the psychological, that is the future you. We spend so much time when we're doing coaching and counseling and therapy, thinking about who you've been and who you are. But the most important question is to understand who you can become. And so if someone is defensive, so the image that's just flashed into my mind is a huge, huge reservoir of fluid, talent and emotion images that's being held back by a dam. And there's a tap that needs to be opened up somewhere to start channeling all the power of that imagination. So yeah, as soon as someone becomes defensive, and you can hear it in their language, they might refuse to participate and not accept invitation, but they'll say, you'll hear things in their language like, oh, I don't want to put my head above the parapet. And you think, right, so they're behind a castle wall. Let's find out where that castle is. Or just anything like that. Oh, I dodged a bullet with that one. Like, well, who's firing at you? Who's sniping at you? So we can do all that. So as soon as you hear that linguistic image in the first minute or two, then you don't need to explicitly say to your client, aha, I heard you say that, so that means this. But you start to form your own hypothesis and think, right, so this is the space that I'm in with this client. Let's navigate our way through this space to get to an outcome.
Notice that you played in with their metaphor. You didn't, insert your own metaphors there. You simply took what they had and then worked with that. Yeah.
Yeah, because they're describing their world, their simulation, and the invitation is for you to step in it and honor it, but also help them navigate it.
Yeah. Well, Ian, as always, conversations with you are wonderful and rich, and they are far-reaching. So thank you for coming and sharing this work with us. Everyone, you can find Ian on LinkedIn, and then I'll let him speak, as I just spoke over him. I'm ever so good at that. So Ian.
Yeah, well, thank you for yeah, not being defensive, everyone. Thank you for stepping into this space with me,
Yeah.
and sharing some of this work. And again, I'd invite you to those 12 images that emerged for you, to play around with them and see how they might be connected and see what might emerge for you. And yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you'd like to explore any of this work a bit more, that'd be wonderful, because it'd be great to explore your work as well. Thank you so much.